In Sacramento, the legislative session wrapped up this week after a flurry of bills and some 11th hour wrangling. Lawmakers reached agreement on some of the highest profile bills, including a deal that broke an impasse over a federal court order on prison overcrowding. Some of the other measures that were debated: increasing the minimum wage, regulating fracking, tightening restrictions on guns, limiting immigrant deportations, and even naming the western span of the Bay Bridge. Now, Scott, you spent some late nights at the legislative chambers this week. What were some of the winners? Well,
the biggest surprise of the week was a deal struck yesterday to pass a bill allowing undocumented immigrants to have driver's licenses. That's something they thought would stall, but in the end, leaders got on board with and it passed. A bill got passed regulating hydraulic fracturing, which is the controversial process that could be powering a big oil boom here in California. Another bill increased the minimum wage to $10. That could be the highest minimum wage in the country when that goes into effect. And of course, a compromise solving the problem for now on the prison overcrowding system. California is under court order to move 9,500 prisoners out of its prisons by the end of the year.
And what does that measure do to resolve the issue of the court order and how California is going to handle it?
Well, it's almost a choose your own adventure. There's a plan A and a plan B, and instead of figuring out one of them, the lawmakers passed both plans and they're leaving it up to the judges to decide. Plan A is Governor Brown's proposal. That is to simply expand capacity, basically renting out private prison space, out-of-state prison space, and moving these inmates to those places. Plan B takes a longer-term approach, spends a lot of money on programs designed to keep people out of prison to begin with. But of course, that's not something that'll get the population down by the end of the year. So that involves asking the federal judges to give an extension. But they have given no indication they will give an extension. They have been very firm with California over the last year, saying, no, we set this deadline and we meant it and we really meant it.
Scott, what does it mean? Does it mean if Plan A and Plan B don't work, that Plan C has let 9,000 people free?
Well, the courts have warned that if California doesn't figure something out, they might step in and start releasing prisoners based on time served and things like that. However, one of these plans probably will work, because if the courts say, no, we're sticking to the deadline we've said over and over again, then California does have a system in place to move them out of the system. Of course, it'll cost more than $1 billion over 3 years, so nobody really wants to do that.
Well, go ahead.
What makes Governor Brown think they're actually going to give an extension after multiple attempts to try to get extensions on this and them denying the state?
He's been very stubborn about this. The Supreme Court ruled on this a couple of years ago, and he's insisted he's going to try to bring it to them again. And of course, the Supreme Court typically does not rehear cases in such a short period of time. But the governor, Senate President Pro Tem Darrell Steinberg, and other officials have kind of winked and hinted that the phrase they used was smoke signals, that there have been some sort of messages passed between the federal judges and them about this solution. Because the truth of the matter is, and this is their argument, if California can figure out a long-term solution to keep the population down over several years, that's a win for everybody involved, and that's probably more important than an arbitrary deadline that has been set.
It's definitely an issue that we've heard a lot about, but there were also some other winners. Their suspension of STAR testing in schools, that passed as well?
That's right, setting up another fight with the federal government, because by moving to a different system of testing, California is going away from the system that is used to publish results of how schools are doing. So the state got a very stern email or letter from the Secretary of Education saying you should really rethink this plan, and they went ahead with it anyway.
Is there money involved with that? I mean, do the feds say, and by the way, we're not going to give you X amount?
That's the stick that the federal government always uses when it comes to education policy, so that's something that's going to be figured out down the line.
But they haven't been specific about how much they could withhold.
That's correct. It was just kind of a very terse statement from Arnie Duncan.
And gun control was also a big issue. What passed on that?
About a dozen bills, actually. The most high-profile bill did not pass, and that would have put a background system in place, a background check system, rather, for bullet purchases. Just like when you buy a gun, you have to go through a background check. Anyone buying bullets would have to been pre-screened and put on basically a list of people who are allowed to buy bullets in California. Very controversial for gun rights advocates, so that's put on hold right now. But bills eliminating detachable magazines for assault weapons or modern rifles, depending on what side of the issue you're on, that passed. More restrictions on who can and can't have a gun, and a host of other limited measures.
What other high-profile bills did not pass?
CEQA reform. Of course, CEQA is a wonky acronym that means the California Environmental Quality Act. It's been around for decades, and it's the system on how new projects are approved or not approved on environmental grounds. Business communities have been pushing to reform this for years. They say this holds the system up. This allows people to slow down projects they don't like. This is something Governor Brown wanted to do, but it's something environmental groups and labor groups stepped in, opposed, and that was basically put on hold. Some minor changes went into effect as part of a deal basically pushing through a new stadium for the Sacramento Kings, a new arena rather. But those big changes that the business community wants to see aren't going to happen this year.
So given what passed and what did not pass, what does that reveal to you about how this Democratic supermajority is going to handle legislation from this point on? And there was a slew of immigration bills, for example, that passed.
Sure. Yeah, the supermajority matters because you need that 2/3 vote to raise taxes. No major tax increases happened this year. That surprised some people. But a lot of issues that liberals care about did pass. The minimum wage is going up. A lot of bills dealing with undocumented immigrants. In addition to that driver's license bill, there are measures allowing undocumented immigrants to serve on juries, to be lawyers. So that's something that will certainly energize Latino voters throughout California, who are, of course, about to become the majority of people in the state.
Okay, well, I know you're going to keep on watching this, and the governor has said he has signed most of the bills that passed, and when they're on break until when?
Early January.
Oh, nice long break.
Yep.
All right, Scott Detrow, thank you. Well, Silicon Valley companies are challenging the National Security Agency. This week, Yahoo and Facebook filed lawsuits at the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, demanding that they be allowed to reveal more data about the surveillance orders they received from the NSA. Both Google and Microsoft have filed similar suits. Now, Michelle, what prompted Yahoo and Facebook to file this suit? And do you expect other high-tech companies to follow in their footsteps?
What happened was the companies, I think a lot of the companies that were named in these leaked documents from Edward Snowden have been working behind the scenes, negotiating with the government to see what they can get in terms of getting documents, getting permission to have documents released. They can't release them or really speak about them because they're classified. So Google and Microsoft sued in June. Negotiations went back and forth with the government and they failed. And so Yahoo and Facebook joined this week. So that's what kind of prompted Yahoo and Facebook to join.
But how are they framing their arguments? Is this a First Amendment issue for them?
Yep, that's exactly right. They argue that they already have the right under the First Amendment to speak about things that happen to the company, and I guess companies have First Amendment rights to speak about things that they do with their users. And they make that argument very clearly in their filings.
There have been months and months of revelations on this, and people are upset. These companies are especially upset. But is there any indication that any of these policies are ever going to change in terms of the NSA activity that fuels all of this?
I don't think that anything will change in terms of spying and surveillance. And I was joking with a colleague that wouldn't it be terrible to have a headline that read, NSA doesn't know cryptography, you know, the kind of the joke of the feds not really getting tech. What we learned is they get it, and they may have many backdoors and other ways of doing things. The companies are trying to figure out how to respond because they're saying they're getting hurt. Their business is getting hurt, especially overseas.
Well, there's an erosion in public trust.
There's an erosion in public trust, and particularly overseas where they do a lot of business. And the rules, the FISA rules, are affecting foreigners primarily. But to Scott's question, there is progress. I mean, the government has come a long way from where it was 3 months ago in terms of disclosure, creating a process, making promises in terms of annual disclosure. Many lawmakers are defending the government, but many are going crazy saying, we got to pass some bills. But is there a bigger is there some bigger policy debate? And that's kind of what you expect the Obama administration to do, to sort of convene a whole bunch of people to say, really what do we want to do here? So far, at least in the courts, they've taken a very, we're not going to do anything differently here. They're fighting.
Well, and in fact, the White House has convened a commission to address these issues. But
True.
I also wanted to ask you about FISA, or the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. So little is known about how they function, what they do.
Right.
So Yahoo and Facebook have now filed these suits. What happens next in FISA? Is there a normal court trajectory where they go through the normal lower courts and then it could go to the Supreme Court if it ends up there?
There's a bunch of things that can happen. This is kind of a little wonky procedural, but what happens is that the government, there's a FISA review court. So say Yahoo, Google, Facebook, and Microsoft get a response they don't like. Say the FISA court says, no, forget it, you don't have any special privileges or permission. They can take it to the FISA review court. Then they can take that to the Supreme Court. Then, or separately, they can sue the government in district courts. So there are other methods. The other thing they could do is they could just speak. They could just exercise their First Amendment right or ask their users to complain. And they've done that before.
But if they speak, they could land in jail.
They could. I mean, that would be a pretty big deal, and not where a lot of executives of public companies want to be.
They don't want to be, blamed for treason.
Right, and treason is the word that Marissa Mayer of Yahoo used this week. She said, if I told you what I know, I could be thrown in jail.
Is there any thought in the tech community, in the government community, about what percentage of the leaks we've seen at this point in terms of the raw documents that fueled the story to begin with from Edward Snowden? Or is that something just Glenn Greenwald knows and just keep it to himself?
I would like to know the answer to that. Are we halfway done? Are we almost done? Are they just milking more? Who knows what that guy got before he left? But he planned it because this is a lot more. It keeps coming out.
Do you have any sense of just like the extent to which it really has hurt these companies' bottom lines in terms of their inability to disclose the information that they want about their involvement with NSA?
That is a great question. There have been studies of, say, how it's hurt their cloud business in Europe and Asia, where there's some, estimations. But the companies keep repeating that they are being hurt and have been hurt. But in terms of actual dollar amounts, I don't know the answer.
All right. Well, we will keep watching because the revelation seems to keep coming.
Yes,
all right,
true.
Michelle, thank you. The Center for Investigative Reporting and KQED have uncovered troubling revelations about how state regulators handle suspected abuse by nursing assistants and in-home health aides. California's Department of Public Health routinely failed to adequately investigate allegations of violence against nursing home patients like Elsie Fossum.
Her face looked like Muhammad Ali did a dance on it, and you could see knuckles. Her eyes were so badly swollen and just hanging, and she was miserable. It was very sad to see.
Mina, you broke this story along with Ryan Gabrielson at CIR. How common is this type of abuse, and what happened to Elsie?
Well, in the case of Elsie Fossum, the case where clearly there were concerns about abuse, you heard one of the staff members at the assisted living facility where she lived talk about how she's convinced that Elsie Fossum was beaten. Her case sat on the shelf in the Southern California investigation section of the California Department of Public Health for 6.5 years. And when I say 6.5 years, that means that the case was closed in February of this year, and the decision was to take no action against the caregiver. And when you ask about how many cases there are, I mean, one of the things that both Ryan and I found when looking at the cases was that the number of revocations of certifications for caregivers dropped dramatically from where it was prior to addressing what the department regulators say is a backlog of cases that built up between 2004 and 2008. So just to give you an example, prior to that, about a quarter of the cases of the complaints against caregivers resulted in revocations of certifications. Once they started addressing what had developed as a massive backlog of complaints, suddenly those revocations dropped dramatically, and you were seeing only about 7 to 9% of cases where revocations occurred.
So what do you think was happening? Were they just telling investigators to dismiss the cases without thoroughly investigating them to clear the backlog?
Well, that's essentially what one whistleblower said to us. He said that he was being told to close cases from his desk, meaning with little more than phone calls, because they needed to address this backlog immediately. Staff was prohibited from traveling to the facilities, and as you can probably guess, an investigation is very hard to conduct if you're not able to actually actually go to the site, look at the layout of the room, talk to people who may have been there, and talk to potentially the victim or the victim's family members.
How many investigators does the department have, and how has that number changed over the years that you're looking at?
You know, the department says that they have increased the number of investigators that they have and that it's more than 20 now. But when I spoke with Ron Chapman, head of the California Department of Public Health, and asked him specifically how many people were dedicated to the Southern California office where this backlog was the worst. That isn't to say that there aren't problems in Northern California cases, but where the backlog was the worst, he could not give me an answer in terms of the number. And when I actually visited the office with Ryan, Ryan had been there twice. I went there once. Both times, there were hardly anyone there. There was one person there on one visit, and no one was there when I went. It was
Where were they?
We don't know. I mean, we know that a lot of the cases are now being handled out of Sacramento, which also causes concern because you need to be able to have investigators respond quickly to the sites when there are allegations of abuse.
Are we talking about, is this all a problem, a result of California's budget problem? I mean, is this about the spigot of money that lawmakers or bureaucrats have had to do more with less all the time?
Certainly resources was one of the things that Chapman pointed out that led to the backlog that sort of caused this cascade of very cursory reviews of cases. But he also admitted that poor management is to blame as well, and that there wasn't good use of the resources that they actually had. So he was actually very willing to say that CDPH had a lot of problems and that they're trying to address them.
So then what happens now? This is troubling on so many planes. What's the reaction been from families of these folks who had their cases often dismissed or closed without any investigation, really?
Well, there is a lot of concern. Of course, there's a lot of anger and outrage. There's a desire to demand more and to have the public demand more from the Department of Public Health because they are the agency that has the power to take action against caregivers who are accused of abuse or neglect or, even murder. I mean, they are the agency that has to do that. So there's that. And then they're also asking for, what they can do to ensure the safety of their loved one in the face of a failing department, and things that, the only thing that has come out, even the government official who was in charge of protecting people said that, the only thing that he can tell people to do in the face of a failing department is to be vigilant about the care that their loved one is receiving.
Are there any signs that reforms will happen as a result of this report?
There have been a couple of lawmakers that have started discussions about this. We're hoping that goes further and that this really shakes things up at the department.
Okay. Well, I know you'll stay on this along with CIR, and we'll see. Maybe in a year or two, something will change. Mina, thank you.